established in New York like Daphne Prieto and Giovanni Terri is another example of the aesthetic coordinates of musical innovation that this network has pushed forward. They are among the protagonists of a renaissance of Cuban musicianship in the American jazz scene, potentially as significant as when Afro-Cuban jazz emerged in New York back in the 40s. They have established their individual careers and at the same time are influencing the New York and international jazz scenes in their own terms. They are opening up jazz as an infinite space of intersexuality and dialogue with their rich Cuban music background on traditional Afro-Cuban and popular music. They share with their singer-songwriter cohorts of the 90s an aesthetic interest in incorporating an array of their generational music reference to their work beyond generic regards. They are blurring the lines of jazz and Cuban music. This network initially attracted attention from labels oriented towards the world music circuit and some major music labels but for the most part they have shifted to create their own labels and independent self-productions. In the current internet-based global music market, where there is increasing immediate access to music from all over the world through social networks and music streaming websites, self-production and promotion is becoming the norm for many musicians, as it is the case for many in this network. They basically distribute their music in social and music networks like YouTube, Facebook, Rhapsody, Reverb Nation, Spotify, SoundCloud, and iTunes. In Cuba, people get access to their recordings through informal markets and person-to-person exchange, and of course increasingly in local venues that have been open for these musicians. Although interested in getting access to the music market, Cuban musicians from this network continue producing their own music, in many instances despite the sometimes narrow and simplistic parameters of the Latin music market. Among other reasons, I think this could be attributed to their need to showcase the strong musical background and education they brought with them as migrants. In terms of discourse, the lyrics of diasporic singer-songwriters from the 90s assume an apparent depoliticized, middle ground or distant position in relation to dominant and ideologically charged imaginaries about Cubanness from the island official discourse and the traditional exile. They are less interested in dealing with Cuban topics as the center of their concerns, either because of exhaustion with the excessive burden of politics they have personally experienced both within and outside the island, due to their Cuban origins, or because they seem more interested in exploring their current existential concerns related with their personal migrant experiences and the global condition. Mr. Haga, Son Ponte pa la Música, in his album Crónicas de un Escribano from 2011 is an example. Here are some lyrics. A rap song with explosive vocal improvisations by Mr. Haga in dialogue with timba piano, tumbaos, and funk rhythms. It provides a very comprehensive panorama of Miami's social landscape from the perspective of subaltern migrants. It talks about what it's like to live in Miami for some musicians from recent generations who are struggling to break into and make their way up to the mainstream music market. The song engages in critical considerations ranging from what these musicians perceive as lack of opportunities and support for Cuban musicians in the local and mainstream market, the visibility of corruption and drugs, and the difficulties of finding jobs. It proposes a conciliatory approach to deal with these challenges, though, calling for the celebration of music and culture as an empowering place of encounter for all Cubans. This type of song illustrates one of the most prevalent discourses of this network of musicians, who in our interviews express in general a need to make songs that reflects their own voice on social and existential concerns about their generation's realities as recent migrants and about the Cuban dilemma that they consider are not reflected in previous transnational accounts on Cuba. However, when they deal with more social and political Cuban concerns, they do it with a sharp, sometimes subtle, and unprejudiced attitude. An example is Sabana Abierta's song Hacer que Volar, published in the album Boomerang in 2003. The song chronicles the important gradual moral deterioration experienced by the Cuban societies in the 90s and reflects upon the expansion of the marginal as a material and existential condition for many Cubans after the crisis. It also reflects upon the lack of alternatives and the attitudes of evasiveness adopted by young people to deal with the shifting situations, which included an increasing recurrence to drugs, prostitution, and the massive migration of friends and family. The narratives from the diasporic alternative music network embodied the deconstruction of the new man into a disenchanted, apolitical, and pragmatic subject, who experienced firsthand the collapse of the socialist utopia and practice in time of crisis, became increasingly disconnected with the official discourse, and whose circumstances forces them to adopt a culture of survival and to reinvent themselves as migrants. As a result, in their discourse of the 90s, there's a post-revolutionary and dystopian posture that mitigate the determinism of the national subject in cultural texts. Their discourse selectively engage in Cuban issues and are more open to other imaginaries beyond politics, and focus instead on a bohemian style as a subtly irrelevant space of resistance, mostly in the case of singer-songwriters. The transnational Cuban alternative music scene, and I'm going to finish here, musicians who migrated in the 90s became transnational subjects living in between different national imaginaries as transnational subjects who are finding their ways of living and working in other countries, and at the same time maintaining links, as migrants who maintain links and visit the island frequently for the most part. Back in the island, their careers have given them increased recognition among audiences and some cultural institutions, like Cuba Disco, which is the main institution for music awards, and Los Premios Lucas for video awards. Musicians like Yusa, Elaine, Mr. Jaca, De Semer Bueno, Alain Perez, Giovanni Terry, Roman Filiu, Telmari, Gemma Corredera, Barbería, Elmer Ferrer, among others, have been nominated and are awarded by both institutions for their music productions made outside the island. Although for several decades, Cuban migrants have been completely excluded from reaching their national audience in the island by the cultural establishment, nowadays some of this music has started to be present in local radio stations on the island. Habana Abierta and De Semer Bueno have become probably the most popular among this network of musicians in the island. They come with the support of an audience of followers that sold out any large or small venue where they perform. The transnational Cuban alternative music scene musicians are opening up spaces for themselves in the island within and beyond the official realm.
Thank you for 5 wonderful presentations that I think complement each other very well. And thank you all for being here. We have a few minutes for questions and comments, but of course we're very short. I would suggest that we pick up 3 or 4 questions and comments and then ask them now to respond. Anyone care to comment?
Well, I asked the lady, these musicians, it may sound like have a basic conservatory foundation. In other words, they have developed popular music, but departing from structural, I would say, harmony and everything else. Everybody, yeah.
Well, actually,
do they come from the province or what? Through the scholarships?
actually, a group of them, like I basically focus on 2 groups: the singer-songwriters and academically trained musicians who transit from classical studies of music for an average of 15 years of music studies to popular music. They basically were trained, this group of academically trained musicians, they were trained in different schools of national arts that were spread out throughout the country. And they, as I say, have an average of 15 years of rigorous training in music, solfeo, harmony, etc. But in the moment that they were studying, Cuban music, Cuban popular music was prohibited because there was this regard for the Soviet curriculum and the classic curriculum as the higher standard kind of curriculum. So imagine in a country in which music is the main asset, that you were not able to study the music in the school because for certain aesthetic considerations. So many of them, after they graduated, they started they were very prone towards jazz So they started like cultivating jazz, but with the Cuban, I would say twisting it, because you know there's a tradition of fusion between Cuban popular music and yeah.
Thank you. Let's look around and see 3 or 4 questions perhaps. Are there any other comments for the panel? Yes?
I was just curious as to how you classify Cuban-American literature, as in, does the subject of the literature itself have to do with being Cuban-American, and writers identify themselves as Cuban-American, or is it just that by the fact that they are born Cuban-American, that they are considered Cuban-American writers, regardless as to how they may identify themselves?
Thank you. Another question, I think, in the back. Yes? Yes, yes?
Since we're talking about the colloquials and slangs here in Miami, could it supposedly count as one of the slangs? Yeah, supposedly, like with the B's and the D's.
Okay, any other questions or comments? Literature and language? Yeah,
Well, to the classified, you mean, or to supplement? I think you two are more in a better position to answer that, I think, yes.
Well, I think it's a combination. I wouldn't rule out any of the ones you mentioned. Most writers, we write about, address some aspect of Cuban identity. Cuban identity, or Cuban-American identity, they grow in the community most, but not all. I mean, Ana Menendez, for example, wrote a novel after war set in the Middle East, Cuba.
And Dionisio Martinez, my uncle, is a Cuban-American writer, but a Cuban-American poet, but he addresses, sometimes he does, but most of his work is about popular culture. It's about
Right. Vanessa Perez, published her novel White Light last year, and the characters are Cuban-American, but they don't make anything out of it. They're just human beings who happen to be Cuban-American. So I think there is a range that you need to consider when you're coming up with labels or creating categories. Does that answer your question?
Yes and no. Because someone did categorize and label it, so which is why you folks are even here. So I'm trying, just for personal reasons, because I am a writer. So the question for me becomes: do I immediately become considered a Cuban-American writer because my parents are Cuban?
You might. I mean, it's a two-way street. You might not be happy with the label, but some literary critics might assign it to you.
I think as a writer, it's important to be aware of that, maybe, if you want to be, but it shouldn't, at least for me, it doesn't. It's not something that I think about at all when I'm writing. I'm simply writing. And I think that's the best advice I could give you if you're starting to write. I've written already a lot. Is to, the categories is something we do as human beings, and it's always going to happen. But I don't think flowers are up in arms because they've been classified botanically one way or the other. So I don't let it. It doesn't enter into any part of my writing process.
And it's not exclusive of Cuban-American. Diaz talks about, why is he an ethnic writer? Why is he just a writer? Why don't we have a category called white writers? But we do, ethnic writers. So it's an ongoing conversation.
Yeah, there's also a big aspect of it that's market driven, and I think this discussion of music was very interesting because it's these new musicians who are they don't fall into a category that people consider Cuban music. And I think this happens to Latino writers too. I mean, if you're a Latino writer, you're supposed to, what's expected in the market and what sells, whatever, is gritty, urban, kinds of stories about struggling Latinos and what people are expecting, what the market expects. But again, these are always going to be there for every kind of writer almost, and so
yeah, I could just do the work.
Phil, do you want to language?
Supposedly. Okay, so I don't really know what to say about it other than, yeah, you hear supposedly in Miami, you hear irregardless, you hear salmon, you hear these types of pronunciations. Sure, they're part of the linguistic milieu of Miami. I don't know if we want to say they're part of Miami English or not. I guess what gives me a little bit of pause about even addressing the question is that oftentimes what people want to do is sensationalize the parts of a language variety that belong to a stigmatized group, be they an ethnic minority group or a working class group or someone who's learning the language. And I want you to know that Miami English is much more than irregardless, supposedly, and salmon. Okay? It's a full living language variety.
Any more questions? Yes.
This might relate to more than one of your panelists because Eva talked about this transnational identity that is forming, that has become something interesting. And since my field of study is international relations, I'm really interested in how this transnational identity is shaping and shifting the U.S.-Cuban relations. And so I just, as a general question, do you see any trend, do you see any shift in the place that Cuban empathy, this transnational identity, find its empathy somewhere here in Miami or Cuba? Where does this Cuban empathy, if we can find anything called Cuban empathy, this identity, this new transnational identity find its home in this relation, in this U.S.-Cuban relation? For example, in literature, what is the trend? I mean, how do new writers, second-generation writers, empathize toward Cuban government or towards U.S. government? Where do they find their place in this very rough relation? Not only in literature but in music, in lyrics, or you might see in exile literature. Where do we find these trends and shifts? Any one of you who wants to take it?
Are there any other questions, or shall we pass it down to
The gentleman asked that question. Main reason I came was because I sympathize with Cuba becoming the State of the Union. It looks like any of this cultural manifestation. Nobody's thinking about it. No, in music or in art, nobody's saying, hey, look, we have done better as Cuban-Americans than as Cubans. Maybe we should think about just becoming part of the federal system. It looks like nothing has come up.
Okay. Go ahead.
Yes, I have a question from you, Elizabeth. Okay. What have you talk about the artists here that you take to Cuba, and you've seen how their work has changed? Have you noticed the Cuban artists who that currently live in Cuba, if they are being informed as well by this interaction, or maybe because of the sudden marketability of their work, or if they're going in that direction?
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting question because long before Cuban-Americans, the ones that I spoke about specifically, returned to Cuba, due to the market, there has been I think the transnational flow has been stronger between Cubans, based in Cuba toward Miami. And that is because there's been a change in attitude about Miami, whereas before it was seen as a place where it's all about retrograde exile politics and no art market, and once you got here your work became less marketable. That is shifting with this idea that Miami is now kind of a global destination for contemporary art, and primarily because there are two very sort of high-profile collectors who have made it their mission to invite artists from Cuba, commission them to do works in public spaces, in private buildings, and in their own private collections. And that's become very visible. Pam, Perez Art Museum Miami, has in the last year, for example, started to really very actively collect Cuban art from Cuba. And that's really a first for an institution in Miami. But in terms of how that affects, Cuban artists' work in Cuba, there are two artists in particular who, and I don't think this is a coincidence, not in this past biennial, but in the 2011 biennial, created these huge installations. That one of them was around the pool of a Foxa building. On one side of the pool was were signs, were streets, like these designs of the streets of Brickell, and on the other side of the pool were streets of Valle Malecon. So the idea is that people would jump into the pool and literally cross from one side of the pool to the other, and this was like a symbolic way of sort of bridging that gap. And that same year, there's another Cuban artist who now lives half the time here, who created this bridge with photos. It was a plexiglass bridge made out of plexiglass boxes, and the images on the bridge were half of them were taken, on an airplane from Miami to Cuba, the other half from Cuba to Miami. So again, it's kind of very symbolic way to allude to bridge building. And that's definitely a shift, because before that, like I mentioned, Miami was not a destination. Cuban artists would come through here, sell their work, do whatever they had to do on their way to New York, Paris, LA, where the real stuff was happening. That's changing really, really rapidly, I would say, in the last couple of years. As far as the Cuban-Americans going back, that's a much more recent phenomenon, and so we'll see how that kind of plays out. There isn't really a space for them there as much. Some institutions have given artists in the diaspora exhibitions, but none who's specifically based in Miami, with the exception of Joseveria, who's in a major group exhibition, but that's an exception.
Yeah, I just wanted to, with regard to your question, after my book came out at the end of last year, I created a Facebook page called Volver a Cuba, Return to Cuba, and where I have been posting everything that comes out with regard to the topic of return. And some of those reports, because I upload anything I find that happens in newspapers, in magazines, and so on. And some of them are by Cubans of the second generation. And it's very interesting to me, to see how they, at least the ones that are coming out, want to be a bridge. And there is one young woman who, her mother wouldn't go back, but she took back with her to the island a painting that her mother had made, and turned it into a mural on a wall. And there's another one who just came back. She went for the first time. She went back for the first time because that's the idea, going back to it. She's grown up, within the Cuban culture, so she feels that it's part of her. And she went to the most recent film festival, and she went to visit all the as a film critic. She went to visit all the film theaters that her parents would tell her about. Vanessa Garcia, who went also to finally convince her mother to go with her. And she talks about building bridges and writing about that experience. Having said that, there are also who resist going back because, as a means of acknowledging the pain that separation, exile, and separation has forced the parents, the family.
So, Juan, I can ask you a question. How do you, can you, how to say, make a profile of a Cuban national identity nowadays? How can you say what's an identity, Cuban identity nowadays? So I can understand it
I
better.
think they all wanted to.
No, I just want to probably to refer to what you said, but what he was asking too, when I refer to transnational identity, what I have in mind, it's, borrowing from Homie Baba, it's a space symbolically, it's a space of in-betweeners. In-betweeners dominant narratives of what usually has been considered what lo cubano is, within the island and outside the island, I mean, by the most visible narrative. So I would, and I think probably this speaks to others, I see that this is really the majority of people who have been kind of marginalized by these dominant, more visible, supported ideological narratives, and they have been creating bridges of understanding, and they have been normalizing relationships with the island from a long time ago, within and beyond the traditional political spaces. This generation of musicians since the 90s, they have been progressively normalizing relationships in Cuba, to the point that they have been able, some of them, to come back after 15 years of migration, and they have been establishing back in the island with the advantage of their diasporic condition. And now they have, they are living with difficulties, but they are, they have an audience, they have a base, so they are taking advantage of that. So that's an example of these different forms of identity, that are taking place, beyond these representations that we usually do, we tend to do about, what lo cubano is when we talk about or think about.
Shall we pick up maybe 2 or 3 more questions, if there are any questions? Okay. Yeah, okay, so do you want to talk about national identity at all? How do you define national identity in your field of study? Thank you. Literature, language, music, art. Take on art.
just by way of like an anecdote, this group that I took to Cuba, most of what I talked about here, it was their first time going back. And across the board, their experience after spending a week there, talking to their counterparts, going through, to artist studios and having these meaningful, dialogues with people there, said it represented a before and after in their life. And in one particular artist, he said, everything that I've done up until this moment now makes sense to me. It was like it just crystallized everything that he had been trying to do. All of a sudden became really clear just from being in Cuba. And that goes to your question about how this kind of transnational relation, like what are the consequences of these experiences? And in terms of a broader identity, national identity, I think that's precisely what we're arguing here, is that there is no fixed national identity. And I think in a sort of like global transnational world where people are constantly moving, where migration continues to be a reality, I think it's hard to talk about what nationalism is or nationalisms. I think that's why we're more comfortable, particularly with more recent generations, to talk about a transnationalism, because these artists consider themselves. I mean, that's where Cuban-American the term comes from. I think it is embracing more than just one fixed idea of identity. Whether you want to call it Cuban-American or Cuban-born, American-born Cubans. I think that, and another thing I want to bring up is that with this particular group, there were artists who had never thought about these issues, who just wanted to go back, to experience it. They've heard of Cuba because they've obviously lived in Miami. It's part of their sort of DNA, but they didn't really have this sort of, and once there, invariably there is this kind of latent, thing that experience touches this kind of latent real sense of national or cultural identity that they had kind of, suppressed because it's been too difficult to, address those issues, given the broader political climate up until very recently, or, just because, it's just too much of a complex thing. But once they do make that leap, it's amazing how it really sort of shifts everything that they've been, taught.
Yeah, just to go off on what Liz was saying about this idea of identity, I think all of us just stop for a minute because I think all of us on the panel probably, and it's especially true for me because I've lived in so many different places as an adult, is that identity is very contextual. And, you know, one of the early Zen poets, Wang Wei, said identity is just the game we play in public. And I certainly find that to be the case with me. I mean, when I moved to India for the first time, I suddenly became Westerner, forget, you know, Latina. I mean, I was Cuban in Miami, and then in LA I was Latina, and then I go to India and I'm a Westerner. And in Pakistan I'm a woman. And, you know, so you start to see that it's so contextual. And I have an anecdote from my mother. My mother was the daughter of immigrants to Cuba. Both her mother was born there, but they're from the Middle East, and her father was born in Spain. And she was watching some documentary about one of the kids of Desi Arnaz, and one of the kids said, you know, I had an identity crisis when I was young. And my mother said, that's exactly how I felt when I was young in Cuba. I didn't know, was I Spanish, was I Arab, what was I Cuban? And it really shocked me because my mother was the most Cuban lady I had, you know, she's totally Cuban. And I said, well, when did you feel Cuban? And she said, when I moved to Miami. So, you know, that's where my mother acquired her Cuban identity in Miami. In Cuba, she didn't feel Cuban. So it's very much and I think this is what we talk about when we talk about transnational identities, is that it's very much depends on the context that you find yourself in.
Yeah, I have a line in my book where I say we're trying to think through this very notion, the contextual complexities of identification with vectors of identity like race, ethnicity, nation, nativity, where I say a woman gets on a plane in Santo Domingo believing that she's India Clara. She gets off the plane in LaGuardia where they tell her she's black until she opens her mouth to speak Spanish and they say she's Latina. So it's like these, you know, questions of language intersect with questions of place and questions of race and ethnicity, which make mapping out, I think, the idea of national identity really, really tricky. And finally, that's what makes Miami such an interesting place, because I think all of our talks show the way that the notion of Cuban-American explode, the oversimplification of understanding identity in terms of any one of those things. For me, from a linguistic perspective, the notion of national identity is tricky also because nations have, at least from the French Revolution on, in the West, been articulated around the notion of one language, one nation, one people, which, you know, worked well in a particular historical moment, namely the time of the French Revolution, but doesn't work well for those of us who are living in the fallout of exile or in situations of linguistic and cultural contact. Miami shows, indeed, going to Latino communities elsewhere in the United States, South Texas, Southern California, New York City, the United States